I did a presentation to a clinical excellence network on selective mutism earlier in the week, and we answered quite a few questions, but we ran out of time to answer all of them. So this is a few of the questions that needed covering. They were all good questions. The first one was, what is the age of onset? And that is usually when they either start nursery or they start school. But interestingly, in the survey that I did, which were 505 young people, 23% had actually started when they started secondary school. Some of them had given more information, which appeared to be experiences of bullying. And then others had given information where I wondered whether they'd had low profile selective mutism in primary school. So they'd not been able to talk fully and freely, but they'd got by with sort of minimal responses, which had not been picked up in a class of 30. But then when they started secondary school, that it had become high profile, which I think is a huge possibility. Because if you think about how nurturing and safer a primary school is, and how if your nervous system is stretched, to move into a secondary school system would be hell for your system. How do you make them feel relaxed when they come in? Well, when I had my therapy dog, um, he did that for me. I never really needed to think about it because most of them really like dogs and they would then just come in to see the dog. Other times they might not want to get out of the car, but if I sent the dog out, the pair of them would soon be coming into the through the clinic door. But I use all the strategies that I use when working with children with PDA. So as I mentioned on the day, there's a lot of parallels between selective mutism and PDA. And the PDA Society recommend PANDA strategies. And they're basically just strategies to put people at ease and make them feel relaxed. But what we try to do, we try not to feel like therapists. We try to be their equal. I don't make eye contact. I try and sit lower than them. I'll take my shoes off and sit on the floor or lie on the floor. Um, I don't ask direct questions. I use declarative language. I do an awful lot of wondering. But it's quite surprising how you can make them feel relaxed enough to speak to you, even if perhaps they don't in other areas. So, with the younger ones, oh, I like her shoes. I wonder where she got those from. Wonder if they do them in my size. They'll soon say, no, they don't, or whatever. But make sure there's an exit. So don't stand in front of the door. So all those things that you would do to make anybody feel much more relaxed and safer. I also tell them that they don't have to speak to me if they don't want to. So we might find non-verbal ways of doing that. Sometimes they're really fun ways. Other times I might use more of a talking mats type style, but it's definitely PDA style. Who can diagnose? Well, if you look on the NHS website, it will show you that speech and language therapists can diagnose. We don't need to have a clinical psychologist on board to be able to do that. What I would say, though, is you do need more training and experience in selective mutism before you can actually do that, because there's an awful lot really that we need to look at to make sure we're getting it right. But certainly speech and language therapists can. In some areas, CAMS would take on responsibility for that. Some areas, educational psychologists would take responsibility for that. So it depends on the pathway in your NHS area as to whether the NHS speech and language therapists can do that. But there's quite a few independent speech and language therapists who certainly can diagnose. Is sliding in recommended for autistic children? If you'd asked me that a year ago, I would have said no. Because I thought if you were autistic, you needed a different way of working. Because if your nervous system is already stretched, you can't stretch it further by doing graded exposure, or making you face your fears because you're already at capacity, and that would then blow your mind. But what I've realized is we need a different starting point, and that is for all children, not just if they're autistic. So I've come up with a decision pathway. It's based on my Safe Steps model. So at the start, is the young person presenting with selective mutism? Number one, is the young person safe enough to engage? So, are they attending school? Can they enter the room? Um, so, if it's a child who isn't in school and isn't able to remain in the room with you, then obviously the answer is no. So, we would need to look at the safety and get the environment right, reducing the demands, adjusting the routines, providing safety, safe spaces, certainly no speech work at all. If they are safe enough to engage, is their nervous system regulated enough? Are there still signs of shutdown or freeze or overwhelm or masking? If the answer is no, then let's do some regulation, do some co-regulation and predictable routines. So we'll be looking at the environment, training the staff. If yes, can the young person communicate in any way? Gesture, writing, AAC, whispering. I don't mind whispering if it's a stepping stone. If the answer is no, then go back to safety and regulation, building relationships first. We don't need to see any progression to speaking. If the answer is yes, then what kind of communication is possible? Let me just move this bar because I can't see the rest of it. So can we look at non-verbal communication? Are they able to indicate that way? Now, if you think about Maggie Johnson's confident communication steps, you can see how now this ties in with that. But we've got these steps beforehand that we need to check. Is the anxiety low enough for structured exposure? If the answer is no, then let's stay in emotional safety. Let's do some indirect work. Let's reduce expectation. But if the answer is yes, then we can look at an intervention pathway. So we're always going to work on the environment. Are they ready for speech work? So if they're not yet verbal, let's have a look at gestures. Let's look at writing. Let's look at using tech. We're building success without speech. And then we might look at speech elicitation if they're ready. So we might do some sliding in at that point, or some shaping, or some desensitization, but only when we're sure their nervous system is ready. And that's why I mentioned about working with an OT. That's when they can really help me. Is speech achieved with one safe person? So I don't mind whether it's whispering or minimal vocal. I don't mind, but is it achieved with one safe person? If no, then obviously we adjust and we backtrack, and there's nothing wrong with going backwards, because it's about looking at the individual's needs. If the answer is yes, then we could do some generalization, but just one variable at a time. So this might be when we go from one to two people, then to a group, then to the teacher, or we look at the places and we look at from one room to another room. So I won't bore you with the rest of that, but this is based on a safe steps situation. So that's actually something that I talk about in my book that's coming out later in the month. So the idea is it's a handbook. So whether you're a speech and language therapist, whether you are a professional, whether you're a teacher, I'm not saying they're not professionals, whether you're a parent, there's parts in that for all of you. So certainly for a speech and language therapist, it would look at the diagnosis and the diagnostic process. It would also look about how to write an EHCP with some really good frameworks for you for that. But it introduces you to my Safe Steps model and shows you how that fits in with the more traditional ways of working with selective mutism that I believe need to come first, definitely if the child is neurodivergent, but maybe for everybody. And my first book on selective mutism, Doing What It Takes, we have loads and loads of case studies in there that shows how intervention needs to be flexible and completely tailored to the child. So the questions that talked about, well, what would you do? I don't know, because I completely tailor it to the child. And I found that my role has varied. But I've written it to sit alongside clinical questions like the ones that were asked in the session. And then we're doing some accredited training in October. So it's CPD accredited, and that will actually give you everything that you need. So it talks about teenagers. So if you've not done any selective mutism training, it doesn't matter because we're actually starting from scratch with the teenagers. So even people who've done the 4-part Maggie Johnson course, there'll still be new things for you on there. And it will give you everything that you need to be able to take on a teenage client and feel confident that you know that you're doing the right thing. So it's a 2-day course. It's face to face in Uttoxeter, but it will actually give you everything you need. There were some other questions on there that I think, as I said, we need longer to talk about. So the assessing a child, if they have selective mutism, how can you assess them for autism? It needs a skilled clinician. It needs someone who really understands the nuances of autism and who understands to get the most out of doing the other parts of the assessment, not just something like the ADOS. So the parent diagnosis, the parent interview is really key. But what I would like to do, the Evelina Centre did a protocol about just that, but that's not readily available. So I would like to do something with a clinical psychologist and maybe Lucy and Ruth to look at a protocol that we could use, that we could share, that we could develop further. So watch this space. So thank you for listening.